For the past 6 to 8 months, I've been telling people that I fully believe the Russian population shares responsibility with the Kremlin for the military actions in Ukraine. This includes everything from striking civilian targets to kidnapping children to committing war crimes across the country. You don't have a culture that is that corrupt and that morally bankrupt that fields a military as it is right now without having the population be somewhat responsible for that. However, an article came out in Foreign Affairs that changed my view somewhat on what I think the engagement of Russians is. It's not necessarily that I think the Russian people are cheering for Putin and cheering for the Kremlin to destroy Ukraine and wipe them off the face of the earth, but really they just don't care. They're just completely indifferent and are not engaged in what is going on. And this follows the historical trend for Russia going back to the early 20th and 21st century, where really the only time the Russians became engaged in what their government was doing was during the Bolshevik Revolution. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet collapse was absolutely an external situation. And the Russians have been fairly content to avoid any kind of civic responsibility for that period of time. Putin and the Kremlin play off of this. A disengaged public is good for Putin because it means that he can just sit back and make decisions so long as it doesn't really disrupt the lives of the average day-to-day Russian. This is unlike the US and Europe, where we do everything from conduct national protests to attend planning and zoning meetings to voice our opinion. Civic life in the US and Europe is a part of who we are. We express it all the time, which is why we argue with each other all the time. And the Russians generally don't argue with each other all the time. It's because they just don't care. And the reason behind that makes sense. When you get too uppity in countering the Kremlin or the Duma or the military or even larger corporations and oligarchies such as Gazprom, etc., at best you could receive a beating from the police. At worst, you end up succumbing to an accident. And we know what a Russian accident looks like. And make no mistake, under Putin's reign, the Russian people's lives got better up until about 4 or 5 years ago, when the standard of living started to decline precipitously in Russia, largely because of mismanagement of COVID, mismanagement of the economy, not diversifying, etc., because green tech's coming online, demographic problems. I made whole videos of this before. So mostly it was the rural parts of the country, though, that were struggling with these problems. Moscow and St. Petersburg, as per usual, are always insulated. They are insulated now. I showed that image from BBC Russia that talked about the lack of deaths in Moscow and St. Petersburg with regard to this war. And it makes sense because those are where the protests would start. Interestingly, we in the collective West miscalculated this because we thought, like us, the dynamic would be overturned. This dynamic where the Russian people don't care would be shaken by the war in Ukraine. The Russian people would be shocked so much, not only by the news coming out of Ukraine, but also by their inflation rate hitting nearly 14%, by their unemployment doubling, although it has gone back down to its previous rates, by having international brands leave Russia, isolating the country completely from being able to travel. But that didn't happen. In addition, we watched in kind of a shock as the Russian media flat out lies and spins one lie that counters another lie that changes the next day. And we wonder, how can they buy this shit? Well, it's not that they buy it. It's just that they don't care. They realize that the government in the Kremlin has its own island and the people have their own island. And as long as they're not combating each other, life in Russia stays relatively stable. A recent poll by the Levada Center, which is really one of the only think tanks still operating in Russia that has an independent-minded poll, the rest get shut down because obviously polling in Russia reflects poorly on what Russia is doing. But the people don't respond to terms like demilitarization, denazification, the special military operation, and approval ratings don't change left or right. The Russians are just as detached as they have always been. This Levada Center poll showed that 50% of the respondents were paying little to no attention to events in Ukraine. They just aren't paying attention. And if they are paying attention, they don't care. They don't care what happens on a day-to-day basis. One of the respondents to the poll said, "We know that bombs are falling somewhere, but can't do anything about it, and it's all rather traumatic, so you better not look at it or think about it too much, otherwise you'll make yourself sick." That's massive detachment and absolutely abdicating any kind of responsibility for what you would do to hold your officials accountable. But again, this is par for the course for Russia. Now, make no mistake, inwardly, Russians are very cynical about their government. They're not a big fan of what their government does, but when the chips are down, they will convey loyalty because they're still Russian ethnically and they still have to tie into some larger group. And the reality is Putin keeps the Kremlin out of the people's lives, and the people stay out of the Kremlin's lives, or they are dealt with. However, things can get bad within Russia. One of those times came last year when the conscription came up and Putin was trying to draft around 300,000 troops to go fight in Ukraine. Well, when that conscription order went out, Russians do what they always do when there's a problem that they need to face. They generally evade it, or they just escape or leave. And that is what happened. 200,000 to 400,000 men fled the country. Now, so for those of you that are going to be like, well, the U.S. did the same thing in Vietnam. Well, the U.S. saw about 100,000 draft dodgers flee the country over a 10-year period. The difference is the U.S. drafted 2.2 million and had 100,000 draft dodgers. Russia drafted 300,000 and had 300,000 draft dodgers. But Russia had that happen in a year. The U.S. had it in 10 years. Instead, in the U.S., we generally protested the war. We re-elected new officials that changed the course. And interestingly, for Russia, they don't do that. They just kind of turn their head buried in the sand, or they just flat out leave and flee, which is why we've seen over 700,000 people leave Russia since this war has taken place. Even though the draft concerned Russians who stayed, they didn't really push for change. Ekaterina Shulman, a Russian political scientist, said that unless you were drafted, the war still mattered very little to you. You might hear something about the war on the television for a few minutes in the evening, and then the newscaster blabbers on, and you kind of nod along, not thinking much about it. And that's how the people have been conditioned to live for 20 years in Russia. It's very telling, her quote there. And basically, they kind of see it happening, but ignore it. So for the majority of the people who aren't impacted by conscription, it's a collective meh. It still is a collective meh. The war in Ukraine isn't really that big a deal. Interesting, the U.S. experienced something similar with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan from the years 2008 to 2018. But the reality is we only lost, and I say only not flippantly, but we lost less than 8,000 soldiers in 20 years from both those wars. Russia's over 10 times that mark in a single year. That would be a major cause for huge protests in the U.S. The Russian people have really absolved themselves from responsibility for anything that doesn't concern them personally. And even Russians who are personally affected by the war, say perhaps a sub-parent or someone, if you know someone who's died, they tend to compartmentalize it, refusing to allow the Russian war to lead them to question whether the war is just or Putin made strategic mistakes. Instead of confronting their own government directly, they have focused on adapting, getting their children out of the country, perhaps finding a job that makes them ineligible for the draft, trying to get kids into school. The war has played into the Kremlin strategy of framing the war as us versus them. And the people are starting to buy into this. Even those that did oppose Putin have now chosen Russia's side in the war because they have no other choice. It's either go with who you know or go with what you're being told is the evil side in NATO and the West. Numerous Levada Center polls have shown that the majority of Russians blame the United States and NATO rather than Russia for Ukraine, even for the invasion. So why am I talking about this? Well, Russia is likely going to fail to achieve its victory in Ukraine. We may not see much in the way of the Russian people willing to depose Putin. We may not see Putin really change any course within Russia other than try to take a tactical pause, reset, and re-engage maybe in a few years in Russia. After all, to the Russian people, this isn't a fight of Ukraine. It's a fight of the U.S. and NATO being at fault. And so long as they can latch onto that, they don't care what the Russian government is doing. Any kind of loss will be like, oh, well, that's because they were supported by US, NATO. Any kind of win would be like, oh, that's because Russia is so strong. None of it is going to do anything to change their minds or shake them out of the stupor they're currently in.